Welcome to the second part of a 2-episode series on Gettysburg, the Ghastly Dead. Today we're going to be talking about the sad fate of the horses and what happened to the dead Confederates that were left to rot on the battlefield. We'll be looking at some pretty graphic images. Some will be from Gettysburg, and others will be from different Civil War sites to help illustrate the point we're talking about. We'll also be using the Elliott's map that shows where all the bodies were buried. The Battle of Gettysburg was fought on July 1st through 3rd, 1863. And on the last day, General George Pickett led an assault of 12,000 to 15,000 troops against the Union Army. These men had to cross a mile-long open field while under heavy artillery and rifle fire. Although some Confederates were able to reach their objective, they were quickly repelled with over 50% casualties. At the end of the 3-day battle, there were more than 7,000 dead soldiers and 3,000 dead horses. Burial parties were quickly formed and many Confederate prisoners were forced to cover up the dead. One of them wrote, "The sights and smells that assailed us were simply indescribable. Corpses swollen to twice their size, asunder with the pressure of gases and vapors. The odors were nauseating and so deadly that in a short time we were all sickened and were lying with our mouths close to the ground, most of us vomiting profusely." We're standing here at the breaking point of Pickett's charge. Now, according to the Elliott map, between 1,000 to 1,500 Confederates were interred here in the fields behind me, most of which were buried where they fell. Now, here's an interesting tidbit. Not all of the dead soldiers found in Pickett's charge were men. In the book, Gettysburg, The Long Encampment, Jack McLaughlin wrote this. "And afterwards, when the burial parties had begun their grim work, they found a woman had been killed in Pickett's charge. It had been assumed by the Confederates that she was a young boy serving with his father in the Army of Northern Virginia. The father had been her husband, and both were killed in the attack." We're standing here overlooking the Cadore farm. From this location, General George Pickett witnessed the failed attack that would be forever associated with his name, Pickett's Charge. A few days after the battle, Pickett wrote a letter to his wife. "Even now, I can hear them cheering as I gave the order. Forward! We'll follow you, Master George, we'll follow you." Oh, how faithfully they kept their word, following me on and on to their death. And I led them on, and on. Oh God, I can't write you a love letter today, my Sally. For my great love for you and my gratitude to God for sparing my life to devote to you, comes the overpowering thought of those whose lives were sacrificed, of the broken-hearted widows, mothers, and orphans, the moans of my wounded boys, the sight of the dead. Upturned faces flood my soul with grief. And here am I, whom they trusted, whom they followed, leaving them on the field of carnage." The failure at Gettysburg haunted Pickett for the rest of his life. The Confederate dead were abandoned by their own countrymen when General Lee ordered the retreat back down to Virginia, and they were totally disregarded by the Union Army that retained control of the battlefield. The soldiers weren't the only ones to suffer at Gettysburg. The horses and other beasts of burden had a really rough time of it too. It's estimated that there were 72,000 horses, mules, and donkeys, and at least 3,000 of them were killed. Union General John Gibbons made this observation during the battle. "One thing which forcibly occurred to me was the perfect quiet with which the horses stood in their places. Even when a shell, striking in the midst of a team, would knock over one or two of them or hurl one struggling in its death agonies to the ground, the rest would make no effort to struggle or escape, but would stand stolidly by as if to say to themselves, 'It is fate, it is useless to try to avoid it.'" Check out these photos taken just a few days after the battle at the Trossel Farm, where the 9th Massachusetts Battery lost 80 of its 88 horses. After the battle, thousands of horses needed to be disposed of. The average horse weighs over 1,000 pounds, so dealing with the dead horses was no easy task. Usually, they'd cut the legs off and then roll the bodies into a hole or cover it with dirt. At the Leicester farm, where General George Meade had his headquarters, 21 horses were killed during the Battle of Gettysburg, and you can see some of them lying here. In this photo, taken only a few weeks later, you can see this curious mound of dirt near the house. It's possible there is at least one horse buried under that mound. Elizabeth Thorne, the pregnant caretaker at the Evergreen Cemetery, claimed there were 34 dead horses around the gatehouse where she lived. It's possible there were several horses buried beneath these mounds of dirt. But there were so many dead horses at Gettysburg that burying them just wasn't a viable option. Instead, they chose to burn them. And the stench was so bad that many of the soldiers wrote about it in their diaries. The odor from the burning horse flesh smelled like an escape from a hateful charnel house. Over 3,000 horses died at Gettysburg, and many more were wounded. A horse could absorb several musket rounds and still stay on its feet. But after the battle, these poor animals needed to be rounded up and treated as best as possible. And here is where the story takes another sad turn. Horse doctors looked after the wounded animals and did their best to nurse them back to health. If they were successful, the horses, mules, and donkeys returned to service in the army. Lightly injured animals were sold to the civilians to be used in the farms for pulling a plow or for transportation. However, several hundred horses were considered too far gone and were labeled unrecoverable. These poor animals were led to a place called Rock Creek and shot. They were neither buried or burned, and the remains were left to rot in the summer sun, while their bones were picked clean by scavengers. The skeletal remains were visible for decades to come. For 9 long years, the Confederate dead lay in shallow graves and trenches here at Gettysburg. Now get this, many of these fields were still actively farmed, which meant that horse and plow would often till the ground and disturb the bodies. But it was much worse than that. The local farmers were growing tired of dealing with the bodies, and in 1871, they published this threat. The owners of the grounds have given notice that next year they intend plowing it up and will grind up the bones to use for fertilizing purposes. This caused quite the stir in the southern communities. When word finally reached the South that their dead were not being properly cared for, a motion was created to bring the fallen soldiers back home. Samuel Weaver, who had helped transport the Union dead to the Soldiers' National Cemetery, had died in a railroad accident, and so the job passed to his son, Rufus Weaver, to locate the dead Confederates. Here's a photo, not from Gettysburg, but showcasing what it was like to reinter the dead after so much time. The effort took 3 years, and by the end of it, Weaver and his team had shipped 3,320 dead soldiers down south. On June 20th, 1872, the Southerners held a procession for the dead. The remains were placed in 15 wagons and led through the streets of Richmond. The flags were lowered to half-mast, and a band played funeral dirges along the route. And bringing up the rear was none other than General George Pickett and 1,000 former Confederate soldiers. Pickett was there on the day they fell in battle, but he was also there on the day they reached their final resting place. Once they reached the cemetery, there was a simple prayer given by Reverend Moses Hogue. We thank thee that we have been permitted to bring back from their graves among strangers all that is mortal of our sons and brothers, and that we have now laid them down to find their desired rest. The remains were then buried in a place called Gettysburg Hill. A few years later, when General George Pickett died, he requested to be buried near his men on Gettysburg Hill in the Hollywood Cemetery. As we start to wrap up, one question remains. Is anyone still buried in the battlefield? And without a doubt, the answer is yes. Rufus Weaver dug up as many bodies as he could find, but the graves were in poor condition. Animals had dug up the remains, and the farmer's plow had scattered the bones across the fields. Now, throughout the 20th century, many more bones were still being recovered,
and the latest was discovered in 1996, which is over 130 years after the battle. The remains were interred with full military honors in the Soldiers' National Cemetery. In 2014, an outrage went up in the Civil War community when someone tried to sell a soldier's skull on eBay. The auction was disrespectful, and enough people protested that it was eventually canceled. The skull was then donated to the National Park Service and given a proper burial. Most of the Union bodies buried at Gettysburg have been accounted for, but an unknown number of Confederate graves have been lost to time. Only God knows how many are still out there. So the next time you visit Gettysburg, remember that this is hallowed ground. Pay your respects and tread lightly, because you could be walking on the ghastly dead.